the eligibility of medical assistance in dying for those whose sole condition is mental illness. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. I would like to confirm that sound tests were made successfully. Before we continue, I would ask all in-person participants to consult the guidelines written on the cards on the table. I would like to make a few comments for the benefit of witnesses and members. First, please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. For those on Zoom, at the bottom of your screen, you can select the appropriate channel for interpretation, either floor, English, or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through myself, the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For members on Zoom, please use the raised hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can, and we appreciate your patience and understanding in this regard. Before we begin, I remind you that for the last hour today, we will meet in camera to give drafting instructions to our analysts for our report. Now, we welcome to our witnesses today, all of them, all the way from Holland. I believe you may have a World Cup team that's coming over here, but up until then we're friends until we actually oppose each other on the field. So I'd like to specifically welcome Dr. Jim Van Os, Professor of Psychiatry, Dr. Wilbert Van Ruij. I apologize if I mispronounce your name. Again, another psychiatrist, and Dr. Cisco Van Veen. Yet again, a psychiatrist, and I'm sorry, that's all the information they sent us. And maybe I could first start with you, Mr. Van Os. I will hold up a piece of paper. I don't know whether you'll be able to see it there when there are about 30 seconds left. Try to finish your remarks within 5 minutes. So to begin with, again, Dr. Van Os, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, honorable committee members. Thank you for inviting me. I am a professor of psychiatry at Utrecht University Medical Center and a fellow of King's College in London. I advise the Dutch government on the current transition of our mental health services, and in that capacity, I lead social trials of a new form of mental health care in a direction that bears directly on the question before this committee. The Dutch experience, in my opinion, offers a warning for Canada. For 20 years, our euthanasia law left psychiatric cases largely untouched. However, over the past decades, a small group of activist physicians and organizations built a practice through sustained media campaigns. In 2024, the Dutch Euthanasia Expertise Center received around 5,000 requests, roughly 1,000 on psychiatric grounds. Among people under 30, requests rose from about 30 per year to nearly 900 in 6 years. Completed euthanasias rose fivefold. This pattern has been widely interpreted as a so-called suicide contagion effect, amplified by the institutions that should safeguard against it. A contrast this committee perhaps should keep in mind. Under Dutch law, physicians must agree that there are no reasonable options. Euthanasia is, in principle, the very last resort. Canadian law does not work this way. In Canada, patient choice trumps the physician's professional judgment, so a doctor cannot insist that other options be tried first. That single difference will, in our assessment, drive Canadian numbers beyond ours. In 2024, the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities warned that the Dutch practice was unsafe. Persons with psychosocial disabilities have a fundamental human right of protection against premature death. Euthanasia for mental suffering cannot be cleanly separated from physician-performed suicide. It is, in many cases, suicide carried out by a psychiatrist. Our research and clinical work reveal a minefield on every side. Autonomy. Most who request euthanasia for mental suffering are traumatized, marginalized, often living in poverty without prospects. Mental illness, by definition, compromises autonomy. Calling such a request a free expression of choice ignores the substance of the suffering. Discrimination. The argument that refusing euthanasia for mental suffering is discriminatory equates psychiatric suffering with terminal cancer. It is a false equivalence. Cancer with a 2-month prognosis is linear and progressive. Mental suffering is not. Recovery happens, often unexpectedly, through relationships, purpose, meaningful work, bonding with another person, or even an animal. The patient-led recovery movement insists that recovery is possible for everyone. Plasticity is the rule. Criteria. Clinicians do not agree on irremediability, on futility, on competence. The result is something like a lottery. Whether you receive suicide prevention or a lethal injection depends on which clinician you meet. Substance. Recent Dutch analyses show that many who receive euthanasia are women with unaddressed trauma. Their unconscious self-destructive dynamics get enacted in the procedure. The psychiatrist becomes recruited into a deadly outcome. Geoffrey Wayne and colleagues describe how in the Netherlands, people with autism spectrum traits increasingly receive euthanasia for what is, at root, social suffering framed in medical language. The intervention should be social and existential, not lethal. Psychiatry claims it can both prevent suicide in one patient and helps finalize suicide in another with the same suffering. That is incoherent. It is not autonomy. It is not anti-discrimination. It is a contradiction at the heart of our profession. My message to Canada: do not expand. The evidence is not there. The UN, the International Association for Suicide Prevention, and our lived experience point the same way. The social trials that we run in the Netherlands show another path. Care that builds relational continuity, hope, and connectedness. That is the system worth building, not procedural pathways to death.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Van Os. Next, Dr. Van, and maybe you can correct me, Ruiz?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Wilbert Van Roy. It's like, R-O-I when it's, pronounced. I will start my statement now. Honorable committee members, thank you for inviting me. I'm a Dutch psychiatrist. For nearly 30 years, I've worked with people with severe psychiatric disorders. In that time, I've seen mental health services in the Netherlands steadily erode, especially for those with the most complex conditions. This deepens despair and may contribute to a wish to die in some patients. Since euthanasia was legalized in 2002, psychiatric euthanasia, or AMAD, has gradually become normalized in the Netherlands, and this trend has rapidly accelerated in the past decade. In my practice, I now meet more vulnerable, often relatively young patients who are, in principle, treatable. Yet they request euthanasia because timely and adequate care for them has been eliminated for political, economic reasons. At the same time, a small group of activist physicians has adopted an increasingly permissive approach to MAID, often justified in the language of autonomy and compassion. In 2024, with several colleagues, I raised the alarm about how broadly the legal due care criteria are being interpreted in psychiatric cases. The resulting debate revealed deep division and a lack of consensus among Dutch psychiatrists. I speak today out of care and responsibility to warn of the dangers when structural shortages in mental health care and ideological convictions begin to shape decisions about life and death for some of the most vulnerable people in our society. Allow me to frame this with a story older than any of our laws. When the Greek hero Odysseus finally sailed home, he was exhausted and wounded after years of war in Troy. On the last stretch, he faced the sirens, voices promising peace and an end to suffering. He knew that if he listened freely, he would perish. So he asked his crew to bind him to the mast, not because he was weak, but because he understood that the urge to escape pain can peak precisely when judgment is most vulnerable. As a clinician, that image returns to me when I consider euthanasia for psychiatric patients. I have sat with many people who are tired in this Odyssean way, worn down by chronic depression, trauma, or personality disorders. When they say to me, I don't want to live anymore, in most cases, they are not asking to die. Often, they are asking for pain to stop, for meaning to return, and for someone not to give up on them. For doctors, the central question can shift from, is there still hope, to have we followed the steps? Suffering becomes something to be assessed, documented, and ultimately validated by death. Psychiatric euthanasia increasingly involves young people with conditions that fluctuate over time. These are not terminal illnesses. They are lives with uncertain trajectories. Yet euthanasia requires certainty, irremediable suffering. And in psychiatry, that certainty is often an illusion. Moreover, vulnerability is not evenly distributed. In the Netherlands, women, young adults, and people with trauma histories, autism, intellectual disability, or personality disorders are overrepresented among those requesting and being granted psychiatric euthanasia. These are often people whose agency has been eroded by life experiences, and to call this pure autonomy is clinically naive. As a psychiatrist, I'm trained to tolerate despair without endorsing it, to stay present and still say, I don't know the answer yet, but I'm not done with you. That stance is not paternalism, it's fidelity. It's what kept Odysseus alive until the voices had passed. Canada now stands at a similar narrow strait. If you extend euthanasia to psychiatric suffering, you will not simply add an option. You will reshape the moral landscape of care. You ask clinicians to decide not only when life can no longer be cured, but when it no longer should continue. That is a burden psychiatry was never designed to carry. I ask you to pause, to listen, not only to legal arguments, but to clinical experience. To those who have seen safeguards stretch, criteria soften, and procedural replace presence. Binding ourselves to the mast is not cruelty. Sometimes it's the most humane act we have.
Thank you,
Please
Dr. Wright.
do not ask psychiatrists and doctors to become the sirens for people who need our compassion, care, and protection. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Van Roy. Dr. Van Veen for 5 minutes. You still, Dr. Van Veen.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm Sisko van Veen. I'm a psychiatrist from the Netherlands experienced in assessing psychiatric MAID requests. As an empirical ethicist, I've been studying MAID for psychiatric suffering for 10 years now, and I'm currently the head of the end-of-life psychiatry research group at the Amsterdam University Medical Center. Also, I have a research appointment at our National Suicide Prevention Center, and I'm the chair of the committee tasked by the Dutch Psychiatric Association with updating the clinical guidelines for psychiatric MAID. I've been following the debate in Canada closely over the past years, but as a disclaimer, I would like to state that I've learned that when it comes to this topic, it's virtually impossible to maintain a detailed understanding of another country's legal, cultural, and ethical context because it's continuously shifting. So for the remainder of my time, I'll focus on the Dutch situation and what universal lessons can be drawn from that. MAID for psychiatric suffering has been legal in the Netherlands for decades. First on the basis of jurisprudence, which was codified into law in 2002. Our first guideline for psychiatric MAID stems from 1998 and describes a rigorous assessment procedure. However, in clinical practice, it remains extremely rare. Only 0 to 5 cases were reported annually, and it was barely a topic for patients and clinicians alike. This changed around 2010 when the possibility to request MAID for psychiatric suffering became more salient. A few years later, the Expertise Center Euthanasia, the ECE, was formed, which quickly became the center where most patients with psychiatric MAID requests were referred to. With this, the cases started to increase over the years, with about 8% annually until 2024. This is, of course, significant raise, but it's also important to mention that psychiatric MAID to this day remains relatively rare at about 2% of all MAID, and call on their colleagues to perform psychiatric MAID more often. In my view, this mainly caused a strong resistance among Dutch mental health care professionals, which in turn was a fertile soil for a fierce and equally public counter-reaction, deepening the polarization further. This dynamic has soured the debate and may have contributed to the 21% drop of psychiatric MAID cases we have seen in 2025, which in itself, of course, cannot be seen as a bad thing. Together with different stakeholder groups, including the Dutch Psychiatric Association and the National Foundation of Patient Representatives, we are currently working on getting the discourse back on track in the Netherlands to a more nuanced and constructive conversation. This is important for there are still many clinical and ethical challenges that require our continuous attention, which I'm happy to discuss further if asked. Let me continue with my more universal moral view on psychiatric MAID. Drawing on a decade of clinical and research experience, I've come to the following view. Although respecting autonomy is of course a fundamental justification for MAID, mercy is even more important. Because of this, I think it's hard to justify excluding patients with psychiatric disorders whose suffering can be immense or, in other words, unbearable. I do think that MAID for terrible illness is fundamentally different from MAID for chronic suffering. MAID for terminal illness is a way to prevent a terrible death. MAID for chronic illness can be seen as a way to end a terrible life. Both situations require different due diligence approaches, and I think your two-track system reflects that better than our Dutch system, which does not make this distinction. I also think that MAID should be accessible for people suffering from chronic illness, because by definition, death will not end a suffering that is not terminal. Although I see a lot of difference between chronic physical and psychiatric suffering, I do not think these differences are sufficient to justify a complete ban of psychiatric patients. Uncertainty about irremediability is a big challenge in almost all cases regarding psychiatric suffering, but it can also be an issue in some forms of chronic physical suffering. I would also argue that adopting a retrospective view on irremediability is more suited for patients with psychiatric and chronic physical illness. This means that a physician isn't asked to judge whether a patient will never recover, but that the physician is asked to judge together with the patient that they have suffered enough. Finally, a short word on media dynamics. It is my experience that media and social media play a profound polarizing role in debates surrounding psychiatric MAID. This worries me a great deal. For large groups in both our countries, this is not a mere theoretical ethical problem. It's a debate with real-life concerns of real people who are in vulnerable positions. These people deserve that we remain curious about each other's viewpoints and commit ourselves to a respectful, responsible, and constructive debate. Thank you for your invitation to contribute to this conversation, I'm happy to answer all your questions.
Thank you to all the witnesses. Now for the first round of questioning, Ms. Jensen for 5 minutes.
No, I think it's you first. You first, sorry.
Mr. Cooper, you got this totally wrong. Oh, that's the second hour, okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll start with Dr. Van Oss. Professor Jocelyn Downey from Dying with Dignity claimed at this committee that if there is a delay or indefinite pause on the expansion of MAID for mental illness, that, quote, people will die by suicide, impliedly asserting that MAID for mental illness will reduce suicide rates. But empirical data doesn't demonstrate that, does it?
Yes, you are correct. At the population level, there's not a correlation or an inverse correlation between euthanasia and suicide rates in different countries with different levels of both these practices. And also at the individual level, it's not possible to say that euthanasia is necessary to prevent suicide, because even in patients requesting euthanasia, the rate of suicide is very low, so that you would need to actually have a number needed to treat of 10 and a number needed to harm of 9. So meaning that 10 young people must undergo euthanasia to prevent 1 suicide and 9 die without any preventive purpose being served.
So in short, such an intervention would result in far more deaths than it could possibly save.
Yes, that is correct. I've published this in the British Psychiatric Bulletin last month.
Okay, and looking at the experience in the Netherlands, you noted that there has been a substantial increase in MAID cases where mental illness is the sole underlying condition in recent years. I thought you had said there had been a 5-fold increase. Is that right?
5-fold increase in those under 30 years of age. And since 2020, there's been a 200% rise in psychiatric euthanasia cases compared to a 40% rise in total euthanasia cases in the Netherlands.
Okay. And a disproportionate number of those cases involve women. Do I have that right?
Yes, this is seen in many countries. So women are far more likely to request euthanasia for psychiatric reasons than men.
And now, despite a growing number of MAID cases, the suicide rate among women, particularly young women, has gone up, not down in the Netherlands, correct?
That's correct. Yes, there's a tendency for it to go up and not down.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, moving on to Dr. Van Roy, you spoke about vulnerability not being evenly distributed, that women, young adults, and persons with trauma histories, autism, and personality disorders are overrepresented among those who seek MAID where mental illness is the sole underlying condition. Can you elaborate on the experience in the Netherlands with respect to vulnerable populations?
Yes, thank you, Honourable Committee Member, for this very important question. There have been some studies by our official bodies installed by the government who are keeping statistics of the people who receive euthanasia solely on the basis of medical grounds. And a lot of patients being granted euthanasia, they come from from certain groups, as I mentioned, the foremost women, young women, people with autism are on the rise. There's a very big population of autistic patients asking and being granted euthanasia in the Netherlands. And also worrying what came from the British research from Professor Tuffrey Wine in London. She revealed that in many cases, even intellectual disability is not an exclusion criterion anymore for receiving euthanasia. And that's particularly worrying because when you read the statements the doctors gave to justify these euthanasias, they are quite worrying. And Professor Tuffy Weiner, who's of Dutch descent, by the way, she was quite shocked when she read those reports by the body that does the supervision over the euthanasia. She said, for example, that a lot of patients, they receive euthanasia not based on any medical condition or something, but mainly on the basis of their social position, of situations like demoralization or a lack of social integration in society.
Thank you, Dr. Roy.
Yeah.
We've run out of time for that round of questioning. Next, Mr. Fergus for 5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. J'apprécie.
Thank you very much, Chair. I appreciate this session. I'd like to begin my questions to the witnesses, but before that, I'd like to ask you a question, or to the committee clerk. I received earlier today a letter from the minister responsible for health, senior citizens, and natural caregivers, which was written to the minister's federal counterpart, concluding that actually that Quebec is not in favor of broadening this issue. And to quote the letter, she says, finally, the difficulty of having the right diagnosis for mental disorders is a problem for many healthcare professionals and social professionals regarding the potential complexity of the relationship, the therapeutic relationship with their patient or patients if MAID is broadened to those with only mental disorders. And these are the concerns that were raised in the report. I just wanted to make sure that this letter will be part of the testimony that will be considered by the committee. Perhaps the analyst can answer. Thank you, Chair. This is a letter that we received on Monday in French. It is going to be translated according to the rules of the committee and will be distributed afterwards to all the committee members. And then it will be up to the committee members, the members of the special committee, to decide how they will handle it. And that letter will be part of the testimony that we received, or the documents that we may cite when we draft our report, when we get into the drafting process for the report. Thank you, Chair. It is a letter that was received in response to the motion by Ms. Jensen that was passed, where there was a request to produce documents, and the letter answers that order or responds to that order. And once again, I would mention that the letter will be translated, and if the committee deems appropriate to include it, it could be done. Thank you. Thank you very much.
To our witnesses today, I have a couple of questions. Dr. Van Os, you made some very strong statements, one of them which was the situation which, or the question which is before us, is the equivalence of suicide carried out by psychiatrists. I'm wondering if you could, given your experience in the Netherlands, if you could please explain why you would consider that to be a fair comment to make, or is it an exaggeration?
Actually, thank you very much for this question, Honourable Committee Member. This is not a strong statement. This is, in fact, a well-known framing of the problem, that it is virtually impossible in clinical practice often to distinguish between the symptom suicide and the death wish expressed in the form of a euthanasia request. And the International Association for Suicidology has attempted to come up with, a statement trying to guide clinicians to distinguish between a death wish as a symptom of mental illness and a death wish as a rational expression of euthanasia. And in clinical practice, and also in theory it may exist, but in clinical practice this is very difficult to distinguish from each other. Therefore, what often happens is that individuals indeed suffer and express a death wish as a result of their mental suffering, which results from a mental disorder, and are granted euthanasia, so that the doctor performs the suicide. And this is not a strong statement. This is internationally accepted framing of the question before us.
I have very little time left. Dr. Roy, I'll ask you this. You had pointed out in the case in the Netherlands, which has had this available for coming on 30 years, that you said that mental health services are not equally distributed, and that would affect, therefore, whether or not you can make the case for irremediality. Could you just talk a little further about that in the Dutch experience?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a very important question. It's more a political question than a medical question in essence. What I witnessed the last 30 years is that especially the psychiatric care for the people most severely affected by mental suffering, like the population I mentioned earlier, the people with autism, personality disorders, traumatic histories, the care for those patients has been selectively been reduced in the Netherlands. And that's part of our healthcare system, which is a commercial system. It's run by healthcare insurance companies. And for healthcare insurance companies, providing care for the most severely psychiatric ill patients is not very profitable. So this care in the Netherlands, the last 10 years, 15 years, has been reduced quite significantly. And the patients I could treat 20 years ago quite adequately, quite effectively, I see now they are perishing on long waiting lists. And these waiting lists get longer and longer in the Netherlands. And a lot of patients, they come to me, sometimes even their parents or their family members, asking me, well, if this system can't provide proper care to my loved one, I at least ask you as a doctor working in that system to be able to provide euthanasia to this person, to this family member, because you can't provide any care anymore. And that's causing a lot of moral stress in Dutch psychiatrists, as you can understand. And this has made quite an impact on a lot of psychiatrists I speak to on a daily basis, who are very, very reluctant and very wary about what's happening now in our country. We have to be quite clear that people die now who could be treated 10, 20 years ago quite effectively. I've done it myself. So it's a shame. Actually, it's a shame.
Thank you. Thank you.
Madame de Bellefeuille, vous avez...
Ms. de Bellefeuille, and you've joined us on the other side of the table this evening, only for tonight. Very well, thank you, Chair. Allow me to make a comment. I appreciated the testimony of our guests, but I find it curious that we may hear psychiatrists from the Netherlands, but that we were not able to hear from and question the Canadian Association of Psychiatrists. And I'm not a permanent member, but I would like to say sincerely that I have a hard time understanding that we're discussing with people from the Netherlands, but we're not able to question our own psychiatrists who have an opinion. And I wonder about the responsibility of the chairs or the clerk, given that we didn't hear from them and the study is ending this evening. Allow me to say, Chair, that to me,
Psychiatrists and psychiatrist associations.
So I don't know if you gave her the floor. You have the floor still. So to me, it's not because we're hearing from 10,000 psychiatrists that it's a reason not to hear from the Canadian Psychiatric Association. So to me, I would sincerely say that I find it completely unacceptable. Now, I would like to say that I believe profoundly in the right of the person to decide for himself or herself on the degree of suffering that they want to endure. And my question will be for Mr. Van Veen. We know that there are people who are in care, who receive medication, and who are forced to suffer throughout their entire life because psychiatry, community support will not remove their suffering. And if this evening we were to decide to bring to an end this ability of people to request medical assistance in dying if they have a mental disorder, it would mean we're discriminating. We're placing some of the people who have rights, but we're judging that because there's no clinical consensus that they do not have the same rights as someone who has a chronic disease that is incurable or someone who makes an early request under a disease such as Alzheimer's. Chair, I find that unacceptable, and from that viewpoint, I appreciated the testimony of Dr. Van Veen, who said that he thinks, or I understood, that it's not the best idea to remove the right because there are some people who have mental disorders who are entitled to decide for themselves and who have the decision-making ability. Did I understand correctly, Dr. Van Veen, that there are some people who are condemned now to suffer throughout their entire life, and if what they can look forward to at the end of life is palliative psychiatric care, and it seems to me that in 2026 we have the duty to offer those people an option and that they're entitled to decide that they have suffered enough and to make the decision that concerns them. Do you agree, Dr. Van Veen, with my theory that there are people whom we will never be able to remove the suffering that they experience?
Thank you for your comments and question. I do agree that psychiatric MAID should be available for a small group of patients. I do think there are differences between psychiatric and physical suffering, but I do not think that they are fundamental enough and that there's absolutely no overlap so that it would justify a total ban of psychiatric MAID. I do think we need different due diligence criteria, but I've seen some documents from Canada which give me confidence that you are preparing for that.
Alors, je vous donne un exemple.
So I'll give you an example, Dr. Van Veen. The report of experts said, for example, that those under 30 would not be authorized to make the request. It's not because you make the request that you're eligible. So those under 30. In Quebec now, all those who have intellectual deficiency that is diagnosed do not have access to medical assistance in dying. So there are limits and criteria placed on them, and I sincerely believe that we will never arrive at a consensus that all psychiatrists will agree on, but there's a matter here of maintaining a right of self-determination. And do you agree that the scientific community could agree on fairly restrictive criteria, but be able to support a person, for example, a schizophrenic who, after suffering for 25 years in treatment, comes to a conclusion that they don't want to die in the conditions that they deem completely unacceptable, and that the person is entitled to make their own decision? Can we find a criterion or some criteria that would be used to enable a person like that to obtain what they wish?
Yes, I think so. I think the criteria in the law, in the Canadian and the Dutch law, can apply to the kind of patient that you described. And I do think there's consensus. There's pretty much study being performed which shows relatively high acceptance of psychiatric MAID in the Netherlands, but also abroad. I do think also because of the polarized debate in the Netherlands that we have a silent majority, which in essence is supportive of a restrictive option of psychiatric MAID. So yeah, I agree with most of your statements. I would argue that mercy is more important than the right to self-determination in the current Dutch system. So self-determination, autonomy is of course necessary, but insufficient as a criterion. And I think it's important, especially in psychiatry and for psychiatric suffering, to also maintain the criterion of irremediability and unbearableness.
Merci, Madame de Bellefeuille.
Thank you, Ms. de Bellefeuille.
And say,
The
Senator.
next one is Senator Dalphond You have the floor for 3 minutes.
Thank you for the members of the panel. My question would be for Dr. Van Veen. You were appointed, I think, in 2024, the chair of a committee which is by the Dutch Psychiatric Associations to revise the guideline applicable about the mental illness as the. So where are you at in your review of the guidelines?
We currently shifted from a total renewal of the guidelines to a more gradual renewal of guidelines, modulary renewal. We recently finished renewing the modules that were addressing second opinions. There are 2 second opinions in the Dutch due diligence procedure, and we've recently renewed them, and we will publish them shortly. We've just started the next cycle, which we will publish in the spring of 2027, addressing special patient groups, for instance, young patients or patients with autism and some other groups.
So I understand that your work is not to propose to deny access, but to make more stricter guidelines applicable to psychiatrists before they can agree to provide MAID to people suffering from mental illness.
So because we haven't published the guidelines yet, I'm sorry, I cannot comment too much on the substance, but I don't think I can say that I don't think we're gonna make it more strict or more lenient. It's just different. We're making different accents in the due diligence procedures at different points of time, where the goal always is to find balance between safety and accessibility.
Is there an age which is going to be excluded for the youth, like 25 or 30?
This is currently under discussion. We are currently examining that module, and I cannot tell the outcome of that discussion.
Thank you.
Senator Martin for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good evening, colleagues. Thank you so much to the witnesses whom I know it's very late for you, so we really appreciate the expertise you are sharing. I know Dr. Van Veen commented about the importance of having MAID available to those suffering from mental illness. That would be a small group, but Dr. Van Os, Dutch psychiatric euthanasia in your account became normalized gradually, and then it was accelerated. So the numbers are more alarming now. So with the small group of activist physicians helping drive that shift, can you explain how that happened in practice, and why should Canada take warning as to what could happen should we consider expanding MAID?
Yes, thank you very much for this question. So I think what you would like to happen in a country is that if there is a shift in practice, particularly one like euthanasia, then you want that to be well reasoned and well prepared and safe. And this is what happened in the Netherlands, was that the law, as it was formulated in 2002, was open to all sorts of views that I think wasn't initially, seen as a possibility. And what you will see with euthanasia is that, there's always in individual clinicians, they differ wildly in what they think they see before them in terms of suffering, irremediability and futility and autonomy, etc. And this is what we've seen in the Netherlands. If there is a media campaign that will sway, a group of physicians who really think that they are following their instincts of mercy and then expand their practice, then society is not able to keep up with that and to control and to deliberate and to assess what is happening. So I think what should be done in such a difficult issue where there's no consensus for the criteria, it's not about being against euthanasia, it's about who can address this fluctuating opinion surrounding these criteria. I think what should be done is, for example, that you have a transparent public body for oversight with representatives of disability, palliative care, psychiatry, in your case, indigenous and lived experience communities, and not just the activist providers. And this is what was proposed in the Netherlands as well, to have a committee of wise, experienced individuals from all corners of society to actually do more oversight and lead the debate.
Thank you, Dr.
And this is what we haven't done. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. Senator Moody for 3 minutes.
Mr. Chair, Dr. Van Veen, your current research focuses on the intersection between psychiatry and death. You study suicide prevention, assisted death for psychiatric suffering, advanced care planning by patients with a psychiatric disorder, and psychiatric complaints in terminally ill patients. Based on your research that has studied suicide prevention, medically assisted death, and psychiatric suffering, in your opinion, what is the relationship between suicide prevention and medically assisted death for people with mental health illnesses? Expert in this area.
Thank you. So the short answer is that it's very, very complex, the relationship between suicidality and psychiatric MAID. Even the language is complex. We've seen suicide as something, almost by definition, as something pathological. But if you talk to patients, especially ones with persistent suicidality, what they are mostly saying is that they miss a good conversation about their death wish, about wanting to die. They don't want psychiatrists or other physicians to act on it immediately, both through coercive protection or in the form of MAID. They want to have a connection and to talk about their death wish and not have it waved away immediately. I think it is irresponsible to call MAID a form of suicide prevention. But in individual cases, there have been cases where people have requested MAID and get denied, or where there is a delay in the system and people end up dying through suicide. But I do not think we will see that in the numbers. So
Can I ask another
framing
question?
MAID.
Can I ask another question? Is it impossible to distinguish between a rational request for MAID and the suicidality that may be present in someone with a mental disorder?
I do not think that is impossible. I think it's complicated, but I think we have clear clinical guidelines, and the competence is a construct, and we have good international agreed upon rules on how to establish competence. So I don't see any reason why that should not be possible for patients requesting MAID. And in clinical practice, this is sometimes challenging, but often something that we can do.
Thank you.
Senator Osler for 3 minutes.
Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses who are here today. And my question touches on the question Senator Moody just asked, because, and my question's for Dr. Van Veen, because this committee has heard from psychiatrists who've said it's impossible in clinical practice to distinguish between a rational request for MAID and the suicidality that may be present in someone with a mental disorder. And so you answered it a bit in your response to Senator Moody, but I'd be interested to hear more about how that differentiation is handled in the Netherlands. Dr. Van Veen.
In clinical practice, every psychiatrist is trained to assess suicidality. That's also a continuously changing field, where we are now recognizing the fact that we are really bad at predicting suicidality. But it's even more fundamental than that. I think that what we call suicidality, it matters, and there's not an agreed upon definition of suicidality internationally. It appears to me that in the Canadian context, suicidality is a synonymous for an irrational death wish. And if that is the case, if that's the way we define suicidality, then it's possible to distinguish a rational death wish or a competent death wish from an incompetent death wish, which is the result of a psychiatric disorder. And we have guidelines to do that, and physicians all over the world are able to do that.
So that was my question. Can you tell us a bit more about the guidelines? Like, how are the psychiatrists in the Netherlands differentiating?
Okay. Sure. So you have the Applebaum and Griswold criteria, which are well known and internationally recognized. That kind of guide the competence assessment. They are really cognitive, so a patient has to be able to make a decision, explain their decision, use all the needed information and apply it to themselves. They are supplemented in the Netherlands in our AMAD guidelines with an assessment of the congruence, the emotional congruence of the decision, and especially in the context of eating disorders, we are asked to see if there aren't any pathological values involved in the decision-making to choose death. So yeah, that's really, in short, how we do that. But they're pretty extensive, comprehensive guidelines how to do that.
Thank you. Senator Wells for 3 minutes.
Great, thank you. A quick question for Dr. Van Veen. Have you had a chance to look at the Canadian psychiatric guidelines that were developed? And if so, do you have comment on those as an expert?
Yeah, but there are a lot of guidelines. But I think if I've reviewed the 20-page one that was published last year based on the Delphi study. Yeah, I think it's pretty comprehensive and it's pretty close to our Dutch guidelines. There are small differences, but
Thank you.
I think it's pretty thorough.
Thank you. Appreciate that. My question now is for Dr. Van Oos. In your commentary co-published today in the Psychiatric Times titled Psychiatric Euthanasia in the Netherlands, Young People, Procedural Medicine and the Limits of Psychiatry, you wrote about an increasing number of youth in the Netherlands that are seeking medical assistance in dying. However, you also say in the article that, I quote, rejection and withdrawal rates remain substantial, end quote, which you got from the American National Library of Medicine's data that studied the request for medical assistance in dying by young Dutch people with psychiatric disorders. That same report concluded that although there was an increase of young persons seeking MAID, MISUMC, that only, I quote, 3% of all applications by young people result in MAID, which is lower compared with the acceptance rate for MAID PS amongst adults in the Netherlands, with 1 in 4 applications was halted by the patient even before medical files had been assembled. And of the files that continued to be accessed, 60% were rejected due to eligibility screening. So that was in your article. So my question for you is this. Wouldn't this data that you've cited in this commentary released today suggest that the system developed in the Netherlands to protect against unlawful cases of MAID for mental illness as the sole underlying condition is actually working?
No, actually, I would not agree with that because, of course, 3% sounds like a small number, but it's a relative number. In fact, there's been a growth, of like 500% over 5 years in the number of young people getting MAID. So that may still be 3% in a pool that is ever increasing, because what happens in the Netherlands, to clarify, we have 90,000 mostly young girls presenting at the first aid departments of hospitals, presenting with non-lethal suicidal attempts. And it is this pool that is more and more drawn to actually formulating their suffering in terms of a euthanasia request. So the euthanasia requests are actually increasing at the GP, in the psychiatric practice, with the school counselor. So we see an enormous increase in requests, and then the 3%, of course, maybe 3%, but there's a background of an increasing number of requests.
We're running out of time there. If you could actually send those numbers, if you have the peer-reviewed information making those comparisons, they don't add up with the numbers that we see.
Yes, so this is, of course, a big topic, but
Thank you. We're at the end of our time.
Yes, I'm sure, but not every time the GP gets a euthanasia request, it's recorded somewhere in the Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. Lawton, for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to go with you as well, if I could, please, Dr. Ross. You were talking about, in your opening statement, this idea of euthanasia as a last resort and the lack of any prescription in Canadian law to mandate that. We had heard testimony from an advocate of the expansion earlier, Dr. Mona Gupta, who basically said, very similar to what you're mentioning there, that it would not be appropriate to expect a patient to have tried every treatment available, to force them to try every treatment before going down this road. Just so I understand the situation in the Netherlands correctly, that is the expectation there?
Actually, this is a complicated question, but I'm glad you're asking him. The issue is that there are many treatments that can bring change in suffering, mental suffering. These can be social interventions. These can be existential interventions offered by a recovery academy, which is led by peer support workers. It can be a medical intervention, and it can be a complementary intervention, for example. And the thing is that, in fact, what we see, what is offered to patients is mostly like ECT and medication, and they're not given options to the social interventions that Tuffy Wayne.
Sorry, there's a technical glitch there, but I'm limited in my time. I'll just move on to another section here, if I could, please, Doctor. We heard on April 21st from Daphne Gilbert. She said clinicians agree that only a small number of people will ever meet the stringent eligibility criteria and rigorous safeguards if Canada proceeds with the expansion. We also heard from another witness, Claire Gamache, who said it is a very small number. Based on your understanding of it, is there any reasonable conclusion that you could draw similar to what they have drawn from how Canada's laws are structured on this?
Yes, but the dynamics are a bit different. First, I think the problem is not so much how many people meet the criteria, it's that we can't agree on the criteria. Nobody can. That's the first problem. The second problem is that once you have a procedure in place that people can apply for, desperate people will come and ask for it, and there will be unbearable suffering because it is so difficult to get the procedure. That's what we see in the Netherlands. A lot of the unbearable suffering in euthanasia procedures is caused by the fact that people think it is an option. And then they become embedded and tunneled in that particular wish.
Thank you, Dr. Van Os. Mr. Maloney for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. And I want to thank all of the witnesses, particularly given the time. We've heard from a great number of witnesses with a diversity of opinions, so your voice is very much appreciated. Dr. Van Veen, I want to start with you. Sir, you started by saying, or at some point you said, autonomy is fundamental. I agree with that. You then went on to say, mercy is necessary. I think I got that right. Mercy is paramount.
I think the other way around.
Yes, I agree with both. But then you went on to say that when a doctor and a patient, they can decide collectively that you've suffered enough on a mental health situation and access made. Did I get that part right?
Yes.
And is that statement made disregarding irremediability?
No, in detail in the Dutch law, in shorthand, we call it irremediability, but the Dutch law requires of us that that the doctor has to establish irremediability, and the doctor and patient in the process of shared decision making have to establish that there are no reasonable other options. So shared decision making is part of our law.
Okay. Would you agree with me that reaching that consensus or reaching that conclusion of irremediability is based on subjective complaints made by the patient and the subjective analysis carried out by the doctor?
So all complaints are subjective from the patient side, and I think the doctor...
Thank you, doctor. I'm limited in time. So, see, that's the difference between mental health cases and terminal cancer, as Dr. Van Oz referred to, because in the situation you're describing, where you're some not disregard, but you're doing this on a subjective basis, isn't that really what Dr. Van Oz was getting at when he said made for mental health is suicide assisted by a doctor?
I cannot comment on Dr. Van Os's statements, but on the side of the doctor, it's not subjective, it's intersubjective. There are multiple doctors involved.
But doctor, it has to be subjective because there's no physical tests that I'm aware of that can determine that you have a permanent mental illness. You can't have a CAT scan, you can't have any other type of test that'll show that.
But there's also not a
to some extent.
Yes,
you can briefly
there's not
answer
a
the
CAT scan that can show the suffering from cancer, for instance. So suffering is always subjective.
No, but the CAT scan shows you has cancer. A CAT scan will not show you have a mental illness.
Thank you,
That's
Mr.
my point.
Maloney. Madame de Bellefeuille, pour 2 minutes.
Monsieur le Président.
MP de Bellefeuille, 2 minutes. Thank you, Chair. We'll continue the conversation. Dr. Van Veen, I share your opinion on the fact that a person who comes to you, who has suffered throughout a large part of their life and was not able to halt the suffering, may themselves decide what they want to do in discussion with their doctor. Experts in Canada, in the last report that we saw, with the fairly stringent criteria, it's almost impossible that someone who is under 30 can be eligible for MAID because they have to prove that they took medication, that they had care, and they took therapy, and that it was from one failure to another, that after a certain number of years of treatment that it was unsuccessful and that the suffering remains present and that the person is entitled to make their own decision. Now, I would like to come back to a subject from my colleague. Suffering is irreversible. If you're schizophrenic and you've followed therapy for 20 years and it gave no result and you suffer, it seems to me that the person is entitled, based on a discussion with their physician, that they evaluate the person with all the professionals, that they're entitled as a patient, as an individual, to decide whether or not you want to go ahead with your life in the quality that it exists in. And what I hear a lot from my colleagues, or some of the colleagues at the table, is that it's a kind of a paternalistic approach, not to be able to trust in the decision-making ability of the person concerned. Wouldn't we be better off to say that we can allow it, but with a case-by-case basis, because some might be entitled to it, and if we don't listen, then it's going to be a discrimination against the rights of a minority of people who could end their suffering that's been going on for years.
With not a lot of time to respond, in fact, no time, but I'll briefly give an opportunity for, who was the question? C'est pour qui?
For whom was the question? For Dr. Van Veen? MP de Bellefeuille? Dr. Van Veen.
Yeah, it was quite a long statement. I largely agree. I think, and especially So we're focusing a lot on young women, but if we look at the numbers, the most common people are people of middle age with depression. So maybe that's a good statement to make there.
Thank you, Senator Delphone, for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Van Oz, you said there was an increase of 60% over last year. So you're referring to what you wrote in an article a few weeks ago. It was from 138 in 2023 to 219 in 2024. That's the number of 60%.
Yes, that's the under 30s, yes.
Yes, thank you. And when you refer to the 500% increase, you go back to many years back, to 2002, I guess, when there were about 2 or 3 people receiving
So that's
every
the
year.
rise from 5 to 30 over 2020 to 2024.
Okay.
That's also the under 30s.
And you refer also to suicide. I understand that in 2023, the last numbers we have is 138 cases of euthanasia for psychiatric grounds and 1,900 suicide. So it still represents a small portion, less than 7% of those that are dying, because I understand in your country it's suicide and euthanasia are part of the same subclass for statistics purpose.
Well, in medicine, we consider premature death as a class because they are related, very strongly correlated. Euthanasia is one form of premature death. Accidents and suicide are in the same class, and they are correlated. So what we see is that in the under 30s, euthanasia as a form of premature death is taking an increasingly large proportion of all premature deaths in youth under 30 years.
But it's still less than 10%.
It's less than 10%, but it's a lot. It's a lot, for
7%.
euthanasia to have that kind of proportion.
And the number of suicide is not increasing or decreasing. It's stable.
It's increasing a little bit in young people in the Netherlands.
Thank you, Senator. And the last 2 minutes for Senator Martin.
Thank you. Earlier, Dr. Van Veen was asked whether it's possible to distinguish suicidality from a rational request for MAID, but Dr. Roy, it is also then possible for a psychiatrist to erroneously conclude that it's a rational request for MAID, is it not? Is that possible?
Thank you for the question. It's definitely possible. And from a lot of evidence coming up in the Netherlands in the public debate, a lot of pro-euthanasia and pro-MAID activists have shared a lot of information about patients who received euthanasia. And concluding from that, a lot of debate arose among Dutch psychiatrists whether the due diligence criteria were observed. And in some cases, there's serious doubt, definitely, among psychiatrists. So there's no consensus at all.
Yes, and if there's an error, I mean, there's no recourse. The person is already dead. So,
exactly.
Dr. Oz, very quickly, suicide contagion is a concern. We've heard from witnesses, particularly in the Indigenous communities in Canada. Is this a concern that is being discussed in the Netherlands?
Yes, it is discussed, but belatedly, and we are now, imploring the media to not report on euthanasia in a romanticized fashion like they used to, with pictures and using terms like, it was very courageous and it's beautiful and we let them go in love, because we know those have a very strong contagious effects on young women who feel trapped or emotionally unstable to adopt a similar death wish in the form of euthanasia request.
Thank you, Senator Martin. And with that, we can conclude this panel. And I would very much like to thank all of you from Holland for participating. We realize you've had to stay up late in the night, but we do appreciate hearing your evidence and your experience from Holland. And I'll take my prerogative as chair to also mention I very much like your soccer team, given their history and their style of play. So I wish you good luck in that too. Thank you. Good night. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Goodbye. Oké, nou daar zijn we dan.
I'd like to welcome a second group of witnesses. First of all, as an individual, Alicia Duncan by video conference. Dying with Dignity Canada, Helen Long, who is here tonight, and Euthanasia Prevention Coalition Executive Director Alexander Schadenberg. Maybe we can start with Ms. Duncan. You have the floor for 5 minutes. I will hold up a prompt when you have 30 seconds left and another when your time's up. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you. Hello, bonjour. My name is Alicia Duncan, and I am here today in memory of my mother, Donna Duncan. I first appeared before this committee in 2022. As someone who is not philosophically opposed to assisted dying, I believed that if Parliament understood what happened to my mother, there would be change. There hasn't been. AMAD has recognized that this issue turns on readiness, oversight, standards, and review. The circumstances surrounding my mother's death demonstrate that Canada is not ready to expand MAID for mental illness as a sole underlying condition. My mother's death demonstrates 1, families cannot reliably intervene to stop a MAID death in real time, even in clear crisis. 2, after death, there is no effective pathway to determine whether the law was followed. And 3, oversight in this system is therefore not verifiable in practice. My mother died through Canada's MAID regime on October 29, 2021, only hours after being released from a psychiatric unit following a suicide attempt. She had experienced a significant decline following a concussion. She was psychiatrically unstable, deeply hopeless, and physically deteriorating. Our family did not deny that she was suffering. What we questioned was whether death should have been accepted as the answer in the midst of that crisis. When she told us she had scheduled her death in less than 2 days, we brought an emergency application before a provincial judge who granted a warrant for her apprehension under the Mental Health Act, temporarily stopping the provision. With her consent, we then spoke directly with the head of the MAID Coordination Center, who was also one of her assessors, and raised concerns that she was in an active mental health crisis. That concern was confirmed when she attempted suicide, and yet, hours after being released from psychiatric care, was euthanized. Proponents of psychiatric euthanasia frame my mother's case as an outlier. It is not. Since her death, I have connected with many families across this country who have experienced similar circumstances and are now living with the devastating effects of PTSD, conditions that under an expanded regime could themselves become grounds for MAID. In my mother's case, disordered eating and severe caloric restriction contributed to her physical decline and were treated as evidence that her death was near. In effect, the current system allows eligibility for MAID to be shaped not only by illness, but by behavior rooted in distress, including self-imposed physical conditions. After my mother's death, the second failure became clear. We pursued regulators, police, and the Privacy Commissioner to determine whether the law had been followed. A police investigation was opened but could not proceed because officers could not access her MAID assessment records. Requests for disclosure, including under public interest provisions, were refused. Most recently, I requested her records under a public interest override of BC's Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. That request was again denied. So I would ask, what greater public interest exists than determining whether a state-authorized death was carried out in compliance with the law? The only person legally entitled to access the records that would answer that question is my mother, and she is dead. There is no governing body in this country, criminal, civil, or regulatory, that seems willing to reliably determine whether a MAID death complied with the law after it has occurred. Accountability is effectively shifted onto families and executors who cannot access the information required to pursue it. Public bodies defer to one another, health authorities resist disclosure, and civil action carries significant financial risk for families. The absence of negligent finding is often cited as evidence that the system is working. It is not. It reflects a system that cannot be meaningfully examined. And it is within that system that Parliament is now being asked to expand eligibility. So when I hear that Canada is ready for expansion, I do not understand how that conclusion is reached. My mother's case has been examined in courts, media, and public policy discussions. If a case like hers does not raise fundamental concerns about how the system operates, it is unclear what would. Nothing fundamental has changed since 2022. Canadians still lack timely access to psychiatric care, trauma care, and meaningful recovery supports. And we are preparing to authorize psychiatric euthanasia within a system that lacks transparency, meaningful oversight, and any reliable way to verify whether the law is being followed. When MAID is provided in error, the consequence is irreversible. If Canada cannot account for the deaths it has already approved, it is not ready to expand eligibility to mental illness as a sole condition. We are not ready. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Long, or thank you, Ms. Duncan. Ms. Long for 5 minutes.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to appear. My name is Helen Long, and I am the CEO of Dying with Dignity Canada. We are a national human rights charity that advocates for the end-of-life options that respect the Canadian Constitution and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We support the right of a competent adult with a mental illness as their sole underlying medical condition to apply for and receive medical assistance in dying if they meet the rigorous eligibility criteria under the Criminal Code. The legalization of MAID for mental illness would allow access to MAID for a small group of people afflicted with acute treatment-resistant mental disorders who, despite many interventions over long periods of time, have experienced suffering which cannot be relieved. This committee has heard from many physicians, psychiatrists, professors, and other experts who have contributed invaluable testimony to the committee study. Some experts have stated that mental illness cannot be considered grievous and irremediable. Their illness and outlook may, possibly, one day in the future improve, but certainty about the future is not a requirement to access MAID. There is plenty of uncertainty in many medical conditions, but people with physical disorders are informed about the uncertainties and engage in dialogue with clinicians to talk about risks and their own values. It is only people with mental illness to whom we say, your views do not matter. I remind you that 80% of Canadians support access to MAID for individuals with a mental illness as the sole underlying condition. There are physicians who are confident in their ability to assess and provide MAID for mental illness. Their ability and willingness to do so is based in fact, backed by robust academic literature, and affirmed by countless hours of experience in clinical settings. They are prepared to honor the wishes of the very few Canadians who would be eligible to receive MAID for debilitating, irremediable mental disorders. Today, I would like to highlight a glaring gap in the evidence collected by the committee. The voices of everyday Canadians with lived experience facing grievous and irremediable medical disorders who have been largely excluded from your study. No other patients have been erased from the conversation about them the way persons with mental illness have been. I am here as an advocate for them and to bring their voices to you with the limited time I have. However, my testimony should be the start, not the end, of a conversation with Canadians who have been consistently calling for the legalization of MAID for mental illness. John Scully. I suffer from a severe mental illness, including incurable depression, incurable post-traumatic stress disorder, and incurable anxiety disorder. I was first diagnosed 30 years ago, and since then I have been admitted to 7 psychiatric hospitals. I have undergone every possible treatment and taken every medication known to science, including all the drugs developed since 1950. To this day, none have had any positive effects on me, and some have had dangerous effects. Savannah Meadows, I'm sure you can understand that some mental health issues are so severe and the pain they cause so great that they cannot be effectively treated or cured. When a person is in immense mental pain and no treatment can help them, under the current system, people are left to suffer grievously, which is cruel and unusual punishment. Clemmy, I do understand the concept that there's always hope, that my life could get better, but my anguish won't. I will always be mentally ill. I will always be depressed. My heart can't handle this pain anymore. My soul is exhausted, and I deserve equal access to assisted dying. Claire Elise Brosseau, I've been treated for 35 years. Some people don't respond to treatment. That's a medical reality, not a philosophical debate. Broad assumptions and guesswork isn't protecting us, but rather people's feelings. It excludes us. Equality doesn't mean special restrictions. Speculation isn't lived experience. At its core, the decision to access MAID is a deeply personal one. Canadians simply want the autonomy to make medical decisions for themselves in consultation with the medical professionals that they trust. It is incumbent upon the Government of Canada to allow them to do so. I urge this committee and the government to go further in listening to their voices and to ensure their realities are meaningfully reflected in the recommendations that you put forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Schadenberg for 5 minutes.
Yes, my name is Alex Schadenberg. I'm the Executive Director of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition. I work in Canada, but I also work with people worldwide who oppose euthanasia and assisted suicide. Canada is increasingly seen internationally as a cautionary example. The rapid growth of euthanasia deaths and the expansion of the types of cases are being closely watched abroad. Developments in Canada have influenced debates in other countries, including the defeat of assisted dying bills in Scotland and the UK, House of Lords, Slovenia, where assisted suicide was overturned through a referendum. Rather than extending assisted dying to persons whose sole underlying condition is a medical disorder, Parliament needs to actually examine how Canada's euthanasia law is actually functioning. How has the law been implemented? Is it achieving its intended outcomes? Are there abuses of the law based on its original intention? Does the law require amendments? These questions have never been addressed. We've only actually talked about expansions. Dr. Ramona Coelho stated in her article published by the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, January 5th, 2026, as a commentary on the Sixth Center report on MAID, that although the report emphasizes self-identified disability, all MAID recipients are disabled by definition. Disability refers to any long-term impairment that limits participation in life. MAID is legal for individuals with a grievous and irremediable condition and incurable illness causing irreversible decline in capabilities. Anyone meeting these criteria are by definition disabled, though not all disabled people should qualify for MAID. Common conditions listed for Track 2 MAID reinforce the point. Diabetes frequently appears, and the Ontario MDRC documented a man who received MAID for an essential tremor. These are disabilities that they do not usually cause the serious decline that MAID is intended to address. By emphasizing self-identified disability, the report obscures the real story. MAID eligibility targets disabled people, and a concern was highlighted by the disability community, the United Nations Human Rights Watchdogs, and most recently the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities has called for the repeal of Track 2 MAID, increased oversight of the law, no further expansion, including the scheduled expansion made for the sole criteria of mental illness. So, for instance, Keanu Vefen, who was 26, died by euthanasia in Vancouver December 30th, 2025. Keanu was seeking assisted dying in Ontario, where he lived, but his requests for MAID were rejected by multiple doctors in Ontario. He then contacted Dr. Ellen Wiebe in Vancouver, British Columbia, who assessed him and approved him for euthanasia. Margaret Marcella, Keanu's mother, was shocked that her son, who was living with type 1 diabetes, which did result in him becoming legally blind, was also living with significant mental health issues, which should have been assessed in his improvement for MAID. Keanu was approved as a Track 2 candidate for MAID. Keanu's family was never consulted, which is important since Keanu was living with depression and suicidal ideation. If Keanu's death was is the only disturbing MAID death, then one might suggest that his death is an outlier. But in fact, there have been many controversial MAID deaths. Instead of expanding MAID further, Parliament needs to examine how the current law has led to the outcomes such as the death of Keanu. Parliament needs to have a complete review of the law. More broadly, Canada's assisted dying law is vague. While Health Canada provides guidance, the legal framework allows for a wide interpretation and it lacks effective oversight. Because of time constraints, I'll only highlight one key issue. Section 241.3 and Section 241.3.1 of the Criminal Code states that medical practitioners and nurse practitioners are only required to be of the opinion that the eligibility criteria are met. Now, we're talking about life and death decisions here. That in practice makes accountability extremely difficult, and it makes it impossible to prosecute a medical or nurse practitioner in Canada, even when the MAID death is clearly wrong or deeply, deeply disturbing. The MDRC reports from Ontario and cases that have already been submitted to you speak to that reality. Canada should not be considering the expansion of MAID or of assisted dying to include people with mental illnesses alone, but rather Parliament needs to fully review the law. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schadenberg. So we go now to our first round of questioning with Ms. Jensen for 5 minutes.
My questions are for Alicia Duncan. So previously at this committee, Jocelyn Downey said in her testimony that nobody who applied for MAID didn't want it. What do you think of that statement? Did your mom really want MAID?
My mom told me in the week before her death that she did not want to die, but she just couldn't live like this anymore. She felt she had not received appropriate care.
You also tried to tell MAID assessors your concerns about your mom, her not eating due to mental illness, and that she was actually dying. She wasn't actually dying, just malnourished. What did the MAID assessor tell you in response?
I actually have a text message from the MAID assessor, Dr. Grace Park, who said to us that her health was declined with significant weight loss, which puts her on a trajectory to foreseeable death. Some blood tests show signs of malnourishment, but they have to be requested specifically. And she ended by saying, if Donna wishes to proceed, there's not much any of us can do to prevent her from accessing her legal option to do so.
So what did the blood work from the MAID assessor show?
She said that specific blood work would need to be requested, and blood work was actually done in the hospital. And it said, and I'm reading from her medical records right now, Donna has had a full panel of blood work recently, including a CBC lights, liver and renal function, thyroid function, B12 level, and toxicology screen. All her results were normal.
In your previous 2022 testimony, you also spoke to the fact that your mom's GP refused to assess her because he didn't believe she'd followed through with his recommendations for treatment, but felt obligated to refer her. Was your mom's diagnosis ever diagnosed by someone with expertise?
No, my mother's her vital statistics death certificate listed MAID. And then the underlying conditions were frailty, cachexia, and central sensitivity syndrome. My mother was actually waiting for an appointment at a chronic disease specialist, and that appointment was for 2 weeks after her death. She never made it to the specialist.
Your mother was euthanized only hours after being released from a psychiatric unit following a suicide attempt. If Canada cannot safely navigate a case like that under the current regime, how can Parliament seriously claim it's ready to expand MAID to mental illness alone?
I think it's completely irresponsible to be expanding this. In a case like this, my mom should have been stopped at many different periods throughout the legal and medical system, and there was nothing that anyone could do to stop it.
Now, I understand that despite obtaining a Mental Health Act warrant and raising direct concerns with the MAID Coordination Center, your family still could not stop your mother's death. What does that say about the ability of families to raise urgent mental health concerns if this regime is expanded to sole underlying mental illness?
I think it goes back to the questioning in our first panel, actually, where we are so focused on autonomy that we forget that there's also mercy in this as well. My mom was deemed capable to make this decision for herself, but she was clearly in a mental health crisis. And if you can't determine the two of those, then we have absolutely no way that we should be expanding this.
Now, in your mother's case, disordered eating and severe caloric restriction were effectively treated as evidence that death was near. Does that show that behavior rooted in mental distress can be converted into MAID eligibility? And why should that alarm this committee before 2027?
I mean, most concerningly, any young person with an eating disorder, or in my mom's case, a 61-year-old who had a lifelong pattern of disordered eating, can restrict their calories so they become frail. And anyone who is frail can be currently, under our current regime, found to be their death to be reasonably foreseeable, and they can die now within 24 hours.
One of the most striking parts of your testimony is that after a MAID death, there's still no reliable way to verify whether the law was followed because families, police, and regulators cannot access the necessary records. If Canada cannot account for the deaths it's already approved, why should it expand eligibility to mental illness as a sole condition?
I wish I knew the answer. I have no idea why people think that this is a reasonable expectation when we cannot verify deaths are legal currently.
And since your mother's death, many families have contacted you with similar experiences, I understand, showing that her case was not an outlier. What's your assessment of the risks of more of these cases occurring in Canada if we allow MAID for mental illness?
And there's many points have been brought up by experts. I think for me, what my biggest concern is that we aren't considering the third-party impact. So for families, I know many, many people that have been diagnosed with PTSD. My sister and I were diagnosed with PTSD, which ironically would qualify us for MAID if this should expand. I think that the studies just haven't been done properly for us to actually understand the full effects of what is going to happen should this expand.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Shifke for 5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Et je vais commencer par dire.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to start by saying that I am very pleased to be here with the Senate colleagues and the colleagues from the House of Commons for this study, which is very important.
Okay, Ms. Long, first I want to say thank you for your work and your advocacy. I was a supporter of medical assistance in dying when our government was faced with the challenge of moving this forward back in 2016. And I think that we found the necessary balance in order to be able to provide Canadians with the right to do so. In this particular instance, though, based on the research that I've done, looking at the testimony received so far, just hearing what we had in the last panel as well, where we had Dr. Van Oss say the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the International Association of Psychiatrists, Lived Experiences Holland, say not to move forward with an expansion of MAID in Canada. We had Dr. Van Roy say euthanasia requires certainty, and we simply do not have certainty when it comes to mental illness. We have had psychiatric associations, many other practitioners who have appeared before committee over the last 15 or so hours of testimony that have said there is no consensus and we should not move forward. And just recently, as just a couple of days ago, we had the province of Quebec, where I call home. I represent the community of Vaudreuil in that province, who have shared a letter with us reiterating the fact that the province has not moved forward or given their support for an expansion. They had conducted their own study that came to the consensus that they should not move forward. And it did not have the public support necessary to do so as well. My question to you, and whatever I say here doesn't count, it's your testimony that will make its way into our report and will determine whether we recommend to move forward or not. What are we missing? What are all of these experts, provincial governments, etc., missing? And what would be your strongest arguments against what they have said?
I think you've heard from many experts, and I would point to testimony around the constitutional challenges from Professors Downey and Gilbert. I would point to testimony from psychiatrists like Mona Gupta, the Psychiatric Association, which has provided guidelines in Quebec and across Canada to move this forward. I would think about consensus. Before MAID became legal, palliative care physicians argued that palliative care could alleviate all suffering. We now know that that isn't the case, and I can point to papers that support that. Others disagreed, but the Supreme Court didn't let that lack of consensus stop the first assisted dying laws. Consensus is not a requirement. This government is formed and acts without consensus all the time. I think there is a lot of evidence on the table. Canadians support assisted dying. We see numbers for the Carter decision in the 85% range for medical assistance in dying specific to mental illness in the 80% range. That's across all demographics. Track 2 is supported by Canadians, including those living with a disability. I think there's a breadth of evidence.
Thank you very much, Ms. Long. The next question I have is for you, Mr. Schadenberg. Thank you for being here, sir. I co-chair the All-Party Cancer Caucus with my Conservative colleague, Mr. Dan Albus. We've both had our own experiences, personal experiences with cancer. I fully support those that are going through significant pain, have been given a diagnosis that they're near end of life, and being able to end that at the time of their choosing is something that I wholeheartedly support. What would be the argument that you would give to somebody who says, by denying those whose sole illness is mental illness the right to access medical assistance in dying, wouldn't that be denying them their autonomy and their freedom to make the choices that they deem necessary for themselves, which is something that my colleague, Madame de Bellefeuille, had pointed out? What would your argument be to those people who made that statement?
I don't consider them to be an identical statement, because you were talking about cancer pain, and that's a completely different thing than a psychological pain. And we're hearing the psychiatrist saying to us very clearly that To assess a grievous and irremediable medical condition for psychiatric conditions would assume that there is a clear consensus or a clear way to say that this person is not going to get better. And they say that's not possible. So we're talking about a diagnosis that is not able to be confirmed, and yet the question is, can we go ahead with MAID euthanasia in those cases? And if they were a physical condition and we would say that condition is not irremediable, that case is clearly not irremediable. They are not dying, they're not irremediable, then they would say we can't accept you for MAID, and yet we're saying with mental health, oh, well, we can't determine that, but we might go forward anyway.
Thank you. Madame de Bellefeuille, pour 5 minutes.
Oui, merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Long, we know that the Quebec Health Minister wrote a letter to the committee. Mr. Shifka referred to it, stating that the province is not necessarily prepared to broaden, but it also doesn't want to halt or withdraw the possibility of MAID in the Act. I think we need to continue research. Perhaps that's a little clarification that was not given regarding Quebec's position. I know Nova Scotia stated that they're prepared to move ahead. In the testimony, one thing that touched me a great deal is that you said, why deprive a small number of people who might have access to MAID but who suffer from a mental disorder? You said a small number. When you said that, you're telling us that the criteria are quite restrictive, as recommended by the experts, that you believe that it will only refer to a small number of people?
Spoke to this. I think the numbers that he spoke to would suggest a small number. We always talk about MAID in the context of a case-by-case assessment, that clinicians have to practice within their scope and expertise. Individuals in this situation will have to consult with psychiatrists, psychologists, those that work in the mental health space. They can't provide MAID without that expertise, and a full assessment does require all of those eligibility criteria and safeguards to be reviewed. There's also the risk of professional and criminal liability, which are certainly significant, and I think encourage clinicians to do the right work. Canadians are confident in the healthcare system, they're confident in their clinicians, and I know that we often speak as if they're running amok, but I do think the system is a good system. We have clinicians who are qualified to do the work and have stated so.
Je vais vous demander, vous savez aussi.
I would like to ask you, you know as well, there is a lot of disinformation around about the fact that a suicidal person would be entitled to access to MAID. So we know that according to the expert report, it says that if someone is in a suicidal state, one cannot have access to MAID because the person is in a crisis situation. They have to be more stable. So when we think that we're encouraging a person to request medical assistance in dying in a suicidal state, I think it's the other way around, actually. The idea is that if a person who has been suffering for many years and has no other alternative, sometimes they choose to bring their life to an end through suicide or to refuse treatment, to refuse medication or assistance, knowing that they're going to end up in palliative or psychiatric care. So could you state whether you can give us examples of people who, in your opinion, based on the current criteria, would be eligible for medical assistance in dying for mental disorders?
Certainly, Dr. Gupta spoke to the need for clinicians to assess suicidality and ensure the person is not in crisis. I think Claire-Elise Brosseau, many of you will have seen the media today about her recent filing. That is an individual who has 35 years of significant care. She has had access to every treatment she could have wanted. She has worked extensively with multiple psychiatrists. Her psychiatrist supports her decision. So that's one individual. John Scully is another. You can see information on his story on our website. Certainly, there are very few of these people. There are perhaps one or two others. When we talk to clinicians, psychiatrists in particular, who do this work and who have thought about their patients over the many years. One clinician, for example, said, in my 40 years, perhaps I've seen 4 people who may qualify. There are very few, and if you look at the numbers, I could provide some numbers related to the calls we get. We are not clinicians, we don't assess for eligibility, but certainly I can tell you the vast majority of those who call and identify with a mental illness tell us that they have either not been diagnosed or have not received treatment. Those people would never be considered for MAID.
Senator Delphine pour 3 minutes.
For 3 minutes.
Mr. Chair. Mrs. Duncan, thank you for telling us your story. You gave it the story 3 years ago. If my recollection is good, your mother was a psychiatric nurse, wasn't she?
She was.
Yes, and she had a car accident, suffered a concussions. After a battery of tests was tested for suffering from central sensitivity syndrome.
She was never diagnosed formally with central sensitivity syndrome. My mother believed that she had central sensitization syndrome, actually.
She was living with a partner?
She was, yes.
Yes, and you went to court to get an injunctions to force her to be hospitalized? And you got the injunctions, and she was in hospitals for 2 days?
We received a warrant for her apprehension under the Mental Health Act for further assessment. And when the MAID appointment was postponed, she attempted suicide, and that's when she was sectioned in the psychiatric unit that she used to manage.
And then after a few days, the doctor concluded she could be released. She went back home and she received MAID at home in presence of her partner.
Correct.
And the partner said on CTV, people don't realize the pain she was in. So that's the full story, just to complete the story. Thank you very much, Mrs. Duncan.
Yeah, we don't deny that she wasn't suffering.
Thank you. Senator Martin for 3 minutes.
Yes, thank you to our witnesses. So this is a question for Mr. Schattenberg. Some defenders of the current regime argue that the colleges of physicians and surgeons can regulate bad practice. Now, my family has personally experienced just some errors, medical errors with my father, and he eventually passed away, but it was next to impossible for us to follow that up with anything that we knew that we could do. It was very, very difficult, but based on the cases that you have followed, has professional regulation proven to be a meaningful safeguard? I think we need these checks and balances, so I'm asking based on the cases that you followed and some that you've mentioned today.
Okay, I want to make 2 points. The first point deals with a comment made by the nice lady beside me, and that is that doctors can be prosecuted for this, that they're very concerned about this, so they have to be very careful. And in fact, when you look at the criminal code, it's impossible to do so. The law was written in such a way to make it impossible because it says that the doctor, nurse practitioner only have to be of the opinion that you fit the eligibility criteria of the law. That's not the only thing in the law which is concerning, but obviously speaking, they simply have to say they were of the opinion, and that's it. It's done. Now, as for regulatory bodies in the provinces, there have been a few cases that have gone to regulatory bodies, but there has been no significant any issues. The biggest issue was actually a doctor in Ontario who was it was a very egregious case, and the Ontario College of Physicians decided to say that that person cannot be involved in MAID anymore, but nothing else was done. So in that case, the person continued to be a physician in every way, shape, and form, but they were told they cannot be involved with MAID anymore.
Yes.
So that's it.
So in your testimony, you talked about how we haven't done a full review, and I agree because the numbers are showing increasing, like quote-unquote, choice of or uptake of MAID, and we also hear more and more cases of problematic situations. So what specifically do the current outcomes tell you that makes a 2027 expansion unsafe?
It's impossible to expand MAID to mental illness when you consider how the current law is working and also how the language is set in the law. And I say that for two reasons. The one is the question, when I answered the previous question about irremediability, If you cannot determine irremediability, then obviously speaking, people would not qualify. But if you're going to go ahead and say, and let's say you have someone from their own professional experience deciding that this person was irremediable, then it would be once again a situation of doctor shopping, where people who wanted to die by MAID would go to that specific psychiatrist because that's the one who's willing to approve them. And they only have to say, according to the law, that they're of the opinion the person fits the criteria of the law.
Thank you, Mr. Schattenberg. We go now to Senator Moody for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Long, I would like to ask you questions about Indigenous consultations. In reviewing your website, the Dying with Dignity website, in preparation for these hearings, I was struck by the fact that you amplify the voices of diverse communities. A conversation that you have on the website of an Indigenous mother, Marion Brown, and her daughter, Danielle Wilson Brown, in their podcast, Before I Go, Embracing the Journey of MAID. You clearly are attentive to the evidence about and seek to engage Indigenous people. We have heard in this, in this committee that the only consultation with Indigenous peoples in Canada was 250 people answering an online questionnaire. Of course, it is essential to properly consult Indigenous people. And so I ask you this question. Are you aware of anything more that was done besides the online questionnaire?
Yeah, there's actually a report, Health Canada issued a report in 2025 with a number of engagements, virtual, in-person roundtables across the country, as well as surveys and consultations they did. And you can also see several of the stories on our website related to people with Indigenous stories, related to care, assistance in dying, related topics. And in the podcast from the Browns, they also talked with Indigenous consultants, practitioners, families that had been involved. So quite a broad, breadth of expertise in that space.
Thank you. Just another comment. Ms. Duncan, your mother's case was reviewed by the BC Oversight Committee, the College of Physicians and Surgeons BC, the police. There was no finding of professional misconduct or criminal conduct of any sort. There was no disciplinary action. There were no charges passed. Multiple psychiatrists were involved in her care. Multiple MAID assessors were involved in her care. Do you agree with what I just said?
The College of Physicians said it was a criminal matter and referred us to the police. And then the police, their investigation was halted because they couldn't access the MAID assessment records because the health authority denied them. And then they repeatedly denied our family as well. And there's nothing that we can do to get them.
I think that we have a problem here because if what you're saying is a health authority refuses to give the police information, then that would be a problem.
It's a huge problem. This is what I continue to talk about. This is a very, very
But I
huge
don't
problem.
think it's a problem of MAID assessors, and I don't think it's a problem of choosing MAID and providing MAID. I think this is a systems problem that is between the police and the healthcare system. That is the problem.
So you think that we should expand this?
I asked the questions here,
Ms.
Duncan. Excuse me, Ms. Duncan. Thank you for your answer.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. We go now to Senator Osler for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of the witnesses for being here today. My question is for Ms. Long. Ms. Long, you've been CEO of Dying with Dignity for 6 years. And in your testimony this evening, you stated that people want autonomy to make medical decisions, and you provided 3 perspectives and quotes. In your work with the organization, would you share with the committee the perspectives you have heard regarding autonomy?
Yeah, certainly. We are a human rights organization. We are focused on end-of-life choice and care. So the perspectives we hear are generally supportive of MAID. Individuals wish the ability to control their final days. They wish to be able to choose what kind of health care they receive as they near end of life. They want to make decisions for themselves. While most people want to involve family and loved ones, ultimately individuals want to make their own decisions. They want to be informed about all of the options, and then they want to be able to choose themselves which path to go down.
Thank you. And you provided 3 quotes. Are those people outliers?
They're outliers in terms of the number of individuals that we work with. Most of the people that we talk to are people who wish to access MAID under Track 1 or who are gathering information about MAID under Track 1. We hear from people talking about Track 2 as well, people living with disabilities or illnesses but who are not reasonably foreseeable. And then again, a smaller number in relation to mental illness. Again, of the people that we hear from, many of them are not providing information that would suggest they're eligible. There are more stories like the small quotes I provided on our website, maybe 20, which represents the most of the individuals we've heard from who have a truly compelling story, who feel that they may actually be able to access MAID through this channel at some point. And then some individuals that we have lost during the years of delay, of course.
And lost to suicide. Thank you, Ms. Long. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Senator Wells for 3 minutes.
Mr. Chair, my question's for Ms. Long. Our committee has primarily heard testimony from multiple witnesses that disagree that MAID should be allowed for persons with a mental illness, despite empirical evidence to substantiate these claims. One of the arguments that's been brought up a few times is the idea that someone who is suicidal or has suicidal ideations can easily access MAID. But we know here in Canada, to access MAID under the law, a person must meet very strict eligibility requirements, and being suicidal is not an eligibility criterion to access MAID. So in your experience, do you believe that people with suicidal ideations can easily access MAID? And also, based on your experience, have the people who have sought MAID simply given up, or have they genuinely tried to make every possible treatment first before making the decision to request MAID?
Yeah. No, I feel the individuals we hear from, the stories that I recounted in the quotes, those are individuals who have had decades of treatment. They have tried every option that's available. These are individuals who generally have access to good care. They're usually fairly affluent or they're in a good situation, so they have been able to access the care they need. They feel that they have no ability to get any better than they are. And they recognize, if you read Claire's story on our website, and I provided a number of these in my original submission, she has acknowledged that she has good days from time to time, but not in recent years. And she feels that she will never be well enough to live a life that is fulfilling and happy for her. So, there are a number of these stories, and these are individuals who truly have made every effort and have finally decided that they are not prepared to continue to go on. And, that is their choice. They have consulted with their psychiatrists, their clinicians. They're not making the decision in a vacuum. And in many cases, like Claire's, they do have the support of family around them.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Senator Wells. We now go to the second round of questioning, starting with Mr. Lawton for 3 minutes.
Ms. Long, in your written submission, you said, quote, individuals experiencing suicidality will not be eligible. Before this committee, Dr. Sonu Gained, Dr. John Marr, Dr. Alison Crawford, Dr. Sandeep Gandham, Dr. Margaret McKinnon, Dr. Jitender Serene, Dr. Sanjeev Sokalingam, all testified that physicians cannot accurately distinguish between the desire to die by MAID and suicidality. They are physicians. You are not. What do you know that they don't?
I would just point to the physicians, of which there was a much smaller number, who did comment that they were able to assess suicidality, like Dr. Gupta and others.
So it doesn't concern you that many of them don't believe they have the capacity to do that as physicians?
Well, those who are prepared to do the work believe they do have the capacity, and should they be in a situation where they don't feel they can assess that, I am quite confident they would consult others with expertise, or they would deny the person eligibility approval.
But your organization has a record of suing institutions that do not feel it is suitable to offer this. Are you saying that you will waive that in the future if practitioners do not feel that this is an appropriate course of action to take?
Our institution has a record of supporting legal challenges that support charter rights.
Okay, so you will potentially sue practitioners that don't want to provide MAID for people with mental illness?
No, we will not. Every clinician has the ability to decide when and if they wish to assess and or provide for MAID. There will never be a lawsuit from us forcing clinicians to take any kind of action. Our lawsuits are focused on constitutionality and charter rights.
We have seen through a lot of the testimony that we've heard, we've seen through a lot of the research on this, an intersection between mental illness and external factors like loneliness, poverty, insecurity, a lack of a social network. How many of those things do you feel should justify someone in seeking MAID?
Yeah, those are not factors that are part of the eligibility criteria. There's several papers, Dr. James Downer, Jocelyn Downey, others, Karen, that support or prevent evidence to say that factors such as that social isolation are not factors that are supporting MAID.
Your written testimony says that MAID, if expanded to people with mental illness as a sole criterion, would not expand access to individuals recently diagnosed with a mental illness or those who have never received treatment for their mental illness. Where in the law we're reviewing is that spelled out precisely?
That is not in the legislation, but that would form part of the eligibility criteria and the assessment that a clinician provides.
So would you support in the legislation a reform that puts that in ink?
That is, generally speaking, that is not detail that is in legislation. It's in practice standards, it's in guidelines, it's in college materials, it's in training modules, it's in all of the other pieces that exist.
So it doesn't exist. The clarity you say is there.
Thank you, Mr. Lawton. Mr. Fagiscatos for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair. It's the first meeting that I'm attending as a new member on the Liberal side. I look forward to working with colleagues on the Conservative side, with the Bloc, of course, and senators. Very important subject, to say the least. And on that note, I turn to Ms. Long. In fact, I make reference here to the first session, the first panel that we had. It was really left an impression on me when we had a witness say that in the vast majority of cases that they've observed, now, of course, they are experts on the subject. They're making particular reference to the Netherlands, but they go beyond that as well, that those seeking medical assistance in dying for reasons of mental illness are living, and I quote now, in poverty. They are traumatized. They are living in deep trauma. That leaves an impression, I think, on all of us, and it implies many things about this debate. How do you take that comment, Ms. Long?
Yeah, certainly I think we all recognize that we could do more to support individuals living in poverty or needing access to mental health supports. I think in that same panel, you heard testimony to the fact that we are able to assess and consider those factors in assessing for MAID.
Fine, but I also heard in that testimony that when the door towards a cure, or when something seems irremediable, when that door seems absolutely shut, suddenly it can open. And so, Mr. Schattenberg, can you touch on that? That there is a lot to be said about those living with mental illness not having any hope, but suddenly that door of hope can open, and what would that mean if the government and parliamentarians endorsed a view of medical assistance in dying that would that would allow for this to happen?
So when the issue began being debated again, we asked for people to send us stories of their own personal experiences. And I received a story from an Andrea who spoke about the fact that she was living with significant mental illness between the years of 2011 and 2016. She was in the psych ward 6 times, and she would have wanted MAID if it had been available to her. And it was not available to her, and now she's happy she's alive. Catherine sent us a similar letter talking about the fact that she had attempted suicide several times. She truly was treated as if she were a hard case, irremediable, but then something changed in her life. She's now married, stable, she has a child, she's fully employed, and she's happy to be alive. So,
Thank you. Madame de Bellefeuille, pour 2 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Long, we know that at present there are pending clauses or judicial recourse for people who have mental disorders who request MAID, deciding not to widen it, or if you decide to continue a reflection process, it's as though we were placing the burden on the patients to clarify the legislation. And somewhere along the line, I find that that is quite unjust. Do you agree that we could ask the Supreme Court their opinion on the fact that discriminating against people who have mental disorders regarding accessibility to MAID respects the spirit of the Charter? Do you feel that before we make a decision on continuing, on whether or not to continue on the sunset clause, that we ought to ask the opinion of the Supreme Court?
Step was not taken when the law came out. In fact, the government at the time acknowledged that they felt that they would be overruled by the Supreme Court, but it's certainly a step that could be taken. I think Senator Delphine made the point in an earlier meeting about the burden this places on patients, and that is certainly true, and perhaps not where the burden should be.
Alors, on a tous des exemples.
So we all have examples that we could raise of people who ultimately decided to bring their lives to an end because they could no longer endure the life as it was in spite of all the support from their family and from psychiatry. What can you say to those people should the committee decide not to, or should they decide to remove that possibility from the legislation?
Yeah, it's very difficult. We have done a lot of work, assist suicide training, safe talk training, intervention training. We make referrals on a regular basis to 988 mental health resources across the country. We tried to work with a number of organizations to set up warm handoffs for those individuals who truly need support and who really are not seeking to access MAID with very limited success, I would say. We make wellness calls on occasion when we have to. I would urge the committee, with whatever recommendation you make, to provide clarity, to provide a timeline, to do so as far before the March deadline as you can do. Certainly there are individuals who have put a lot of hope in this, and at each deadline we have seen losses because of the frustration, upset, disappointment.
Thank you, Ms.
Distress.
Thank you, Ms. Long.
You're welcome.
Senator Moody for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is for Ms. Long. As a committee, and in this current process, I believe we have failed to give voice to individuals with lived experience, individuals such as Ms. Brazeau, who you mentioned earlier in your testimony, who, by the way, many of us put her name forward to be a potential witness.
Point of order, we've had quite a few people with lived experience, and we've mentioned it before. So I don't know if that's just, let's set the record straight.
Excuse me, are you giving the floor to?
Sorry, who is?
Can we stop the clock, please?
Madame Jensen, a point of order. Sorry, Madame Jensen, yeah, point of order.
Just setting, point of order, I'm setting the record straight. We've had plenty of lived experience. We have one woman here as we speak.
Excuse me.
Senator Moody.
Because I was about to explain why her lived experience was distinctly different.
You have the floor, Senator
Thank
Moody.
you. So Ms. Brazeau is a person who has publicly spoken about her illness, about the intervention she's had in her life, and her readiness to seek mail. And the question I have for Ms. Long is, as a person who interacts with individuals such as Ms. Brazeau, how is Ms. Long feeling, and how are others like her feeling that we are not listening to their voice, when in fact we are listening to voices of parents and siblings and other individuals in this committee?
Yeah, if I could first clarify, the people with lived experience who have been missing from these hearings are those who, but for the exclusion criteria, would be eligible and approved for MAID. Ms. Brazeau has actually gone through 2 MAID assessments. in order to proceed with her lawsuit so that we know that she is someone who may be considered eligible. This is actually a note Claire gave me yesterday. I am deeply disappointed and I must admit somewhat shocked about what is happening at the committee. I know that there are only so many hours in a day to hear testimony, but I would have thought they would want to listen to a few minutes from someone with lived experience in addition to the people they have heard from who are opposed. I have offered to appear before the committee to provide my perspective as a person with lived experience of mental illness who is prevented from accessing MAID. We so often hear the expression, nothing about us without us, and yet they have refused to hear from many people who are harmed from the exclusion.
Can I do another point of order? I mean, we had every opportunity, senators, everybody, to see the witness list, and now we're suggesting that we didn't.
I don't think it's a point of order, but Mr. Cooper with a point of order that may or may not be a point of order.
You know, we hear on the same point of order, these senators have repeatedly asserted that somehow the witness list was unrepresentative. I would remind Senator Moody that as of the last meeting, 13 of the 38 witnesses that were heard at this committee came from those senators.
Thank you, and it wasn't a point of order. But Senator Moody, you only have 3 seconds left.
Look at the media reports on this.
Senator Moody. Lastly, to Senator Wells for 3 minutes.
Thank you. Do I have the floor? Thank you.
3 minutes.
Thank you. Ms. Long, you mentioned earlier 3 academics and some of the research, particularly Dr. James Downer, who's here in Ottawa, who's done empirical research on social vulnerabilities. I'm hoping that to support your testimony, you would send in those research articles so they can be part of the official record here for our deliberations.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. So our committee here has heard very alarming testimony from multiple witnesses, primarily from witnesses who oppose MAID for MISUMC and of individual cases of unlawful MAID requests that were approved. Cases like an individual seeking MAID because of a broken heart or shopping around for a physician that would give them MAID. Although none of these witnesses were able to follow up with any action they took to bring these cases to appropriate authorities and prosecute these cases, I'm wondering if you can comment based on your experience with people going through the process of requesting MAID. Do you feel as though the current safeguards that are in place to protect against unlawful access to MAID are working?
Yes, I do. We hear from people on their journey and families following their journey. Honestly, the biggest challenges we hear about are those where there are barriers in terms of information access, referrals, that type of thing.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Wells, and we will briefly suspend to go in camera.
you.